Hi, welcome to this week's episode of the Pulse Regen Strategics Policy and Politics podcast. I'm joined once again by my co-host Libby Lyons. Welcome, Libby.
Thanks, Pat. Good to see you again.
And we're delighted to be joined by a guest this week who will be known to many, if not all of our listeners, and for reasons of time limits on our recording, I can't run through all of their CV, but we are joined by Alannah MacTiernan, who not only has been a minister with the Gallop and Carpenter and McGowan governments, but also served all three tiers of government across various stints with the City of Vincent, and also the seat of Canning in the federal electorate, both houses of Western Australian Parliament as well. So I would imagine more or less a unique perspective on public life and policy. Alannah, welcome. Delighted to have you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Libby. Looking forward to the discussion.
Well, I guess one thing to link the two of you would be our ongoing discussion, Libby, we've been having regarding the Liberal Party and women. We've encountered the first sitting week of some are saying revitalised opposition in the federal parliament. Angus Taylor's taken the pew as leader of the opposition. How have you perceived the way he's stepped into that role, and can he surmount these supposedly insurmountable challenges with a pretty key demographic?
Oh, look, I think he's done well. I think Susan Lee. I think talking about her being pushed aside because she was a woman is nonsense. Something had to be done. It wouldn't have mattered whether it was a man or a woman or someone else there. The fact of the matter was that the polls were in their boots and they had to do something about it. And so they felt that, the sitting members felt that they had to do something about it, and so they moved her on. I think it's a hell of a task they've got ahead of them, but, politics is a funny game, and things can change in a heartbeat. So I think Angus Taylor has made a good start, and we'll just wait and see what happens with it. But I think that very much watch this space. But at the moment, I would say any change of government in the federal sphere is a very long way off at the moment.
Yeah.
I actually agree with Libby that, this should not be just made out of as a story of the Liberal Party dumping a woman. Personally, whatever her personal qualities are, and I think there probably were lots of personal qualities, and she told her seat that she'd won off another party for 25 years, so obviously she was delivering for her local community, but I just feel she was not a leader, and she did not have that sort of quality, and was not able to project a strength and a leadership. I think, interestingly, and I've always said that I thought Jane Hume was someone that sort of more naturally, I think, would assume the mantle of leadership, but she'd have to stand down. She's now deputy. Really, I think if the Liberal Party are going to have a chance, they've got to get people like her into some lower house seats in the city. Personally,
Victoria as well, which would be quite a challenge for them.
And this goes then. Personally, I just don't feel that Angus Taylor is going to cut the mustard. I agree that something had to happen. I think there's probably a sense within the Liberal Party that it was a bit like with Alexander Downer. You just had to give him his chance because he had such a view at his core that he was destined for greatness. That he has to be given a chance to do it. Personally, I just don't feel that he is necessarily the answer. And if I was the Liberal Party, I'd be looking at how I could get Jane Hume down into the lower house and have her ready for the next election. But look, I think one of the big challenges that now the big issues we've got, particularly in federal politics, is that we have a party, the Liberal Party virtually has virtually no metropolitan seats, or very few, a handful of metropolitan seats, yet that is where the bulk of the population live. So you've got this challenge where they're looking at fighting the Nats and fighting Qatar, so they are wanting to push themselves into a set of identity politics that probably plays out in those more homogenous rural settings. One might describe it as Muslim bashing. It doesn't play out so well in the city where people have grown up or mix every day with people of all these different ethnic and faith backgrounds. So I think there's a challenge. On Labor's side, we do have some regional seats. I do think we've got to work doubly hard to make sure that we're connecting with the people in our regions, and that we are prepared to put fair amounts of investment into those regional areas, and not just make that calculus of we're going to put the money where the people, we're going to put all the money where the people are, because that's not going to deliver fairness, and it's also not going to deliver optimum value for the ability for us to mobilise our state economy.
So addressing that productivity challenge, it runs through the region.
And it also is just so much of what we want to do, obviously, in the energy transition, and the development of critical minerals and rare earth really does depend on us putting in place and being prepared to invest in that infrastructure in the regions.
Do you think then that long-term thinking, particularly at a state level, but a federal level as well, but do you think long-term thinking is really possible in politics at the moment?
Well, look, long-term thinking is implementing and staying the course on a long-term policy. It does tend to be a bit more difficult. I think one of the things, and I really hope the federal government do, for example, is move to 4-year terms. A 3-year terms, when it is just completely counterproductive terms of continuous campaigning and not having enough clear air. I think the 4-year term does give you a slightly longer term. I think the interesting thing is that a lot of the best policy development actually goes on while you're in opposition, and you build, it is where you really can focus in a sense on building a vision, as many Labor governments, I think we did in the 90s, built up a vision for rail and ports, and then during the period of the Barnett government, Rita and others built on those policies and built the Metronet concepts and had the big ideas. The interesting thing, to some extent, you've got to use your time in opposition to build the big vision, because often what happens is you get into government and you're so busy delivering that perhaps some of the bigger reflection. But look, I am pleased to say, though, and I think this goes back, that we are seeing here in WA some real investment in the green energy transition, and some of it, and it's hard and it's expensive, and you don't get to open a beautiful new railway station, but you have to build. For example, you've got to build out the Swiss. You've got to build.
Alannah, I can recall in your valedictory speech to the WA Legislative Assembly some time ago, and you've done many more things since then, including, I think at the time...
More valedictory speeches.
Yeah, exactly. You were, I think, commencing a step into the federal arena for the seat of Canning. But one thing I do recall you making direct reference to was that clarion call around action on climate change, the need to really seize the opportunities, the genuine economic opportunities that reside in that space alongside the the clear moral imperative, the environmental imperative, and you made I think references to the danger of averages and an average temperature rise of X is like putting your feet in the freezer and your head in the oven, and there's a host of very uncomfortable and intolerable scenarios that can play out if we don't seize that opportunity, we don't respond. How have you observed the response from various governments since that time?
Well, obviously, when I did get into federal parliament in 2013, Abbott took over with his really a very much climate change denier agenda and went about abolishing really all of the architecture that had been put in place, including the carbon price. Interestingly, and this seems to not be recalled, but Clive Palmer actually played a positive role. Because remember, Clive was in Parliament and
I can see the little clip we're going to be taking from
but
this.
Seriously, this is true. So one of the things that some very smart people in the climate world, obviously, got Al Gore to come and see Clive. Clive is holding the balance of power in the Senate. And so Clive, of course, was going to support the abolition of the carbon tax. But what he did is, but he insisted, part of the negotiation, is that things like ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation be continued. But it went further than that actually legislated in the legislation that abolished the carbon tax, the actual budget for the next 4 years for ARENA, and possibly, I'm not quite as clear on the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So they weren't, because obviously people were aware of the trick. They'd say, oh yeah, well, we're going to keep them, but then you just give them no money. But the actual forward estimates were included. So when the nation came to its senses and Abbott was deposed and Turnbull got in, you still had some of these. So it wasn't like a complete black hole. You still had some of the basic research being advanced via ARENA, which I think was a good thing. Now, I am very pleased that when the Albanese government got in, they have made this climate action really very much part of their agenda, and I think they are very genuinely committed to it, and they are putting significant money in now. But the problem is more of I think an international one now, and you see it. Just this, because I've been involved in various since I left Parliament, but I saw the same thing in Parliament as when I left. The lack of the developing consensus about the need to have various pricing mechanisms, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's a fossil fuel tax, whether it's a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Those things, particularly since Trump has arrived, and once the world's largest economy has said that we're no longer participating in any of these schemes, and in fact we're going in the opposite direction, that has really made it incredibly difficult to rely on any market forces. So the most rational things that you could do to drive change no longer work, because once you've got that big American behemoth outside that system, it's very hard to do the market mechanisms. So you've really got to be focusing on things that you can do through direct investments. So rather than taxing, you have to put in a degree of safeguards. We've got things like strengthening the safeguard mechanism for big companies, but it's a very, very hard environment at the moment. The world's attention seems to have gone away from climate change. I mean, that's this seems to be a cyclical thing, which is really quite depressing, given that the problem is, in fact, just getting worse and worse. But let's hope. Let's hope in the midterms in the US that we start seeing a little bit more reason and rationality and international cooperation being valued in this area.
Yeah, well, we can only hope. You mentioned CEFC and some of those investment vehicles the federal government have at their disposal. The
ARENA is very important.
Yeah,
probably
and the
even
trajectory
more.
seems to be to allow them to invest earlier, take a degree of risk that private markets ordinarily wouldn't, in order to shepherd those investments to reach financial investment decision or some similar milestone. Is that the way Australia should be appropriately responding?
Well,
at this point
look,
in time?
I certainly think it's a big part of the mechanism. I just think we've also got to be, and I know it's difficult because they're looking at the next 3 years. But if you look at what is happening so while America is now closing down wind projects, closing down investment in the science of wind and solar, China is developing 1 megawatt of renewable power a week, right? Like extraordinary figures. And India is going down a similar process. And of course, they are investing in the full supply chain. They're investing in the research, investing heavily in the research and the whole supply chain. And so when, America wakes up and the rest of the world feels that they need to look at these issues again, what we're going to find is that China and I think increasingly India are going to be the leaders here, and we potentially will be finding ourselves very much behind the eight ball. But I am pleased to say that there's no lack. I think we do see still a very big commitment from Labor in this area, and I just urge, and you just want to see the public supporting that because. This is going to, people like me will be probably, I can retreat to Albany for 10 years and get a bit of a reprieve, but you are just, young people, someone that's 30 today, they are going to be potentially living through some most hostile climate conditions, and I just hope that people understand that and are prepared to fight.
Yeah, well, they'll be doing that with likely that 30-year-old will also have a good mortgage under the belt to service as well. You've been hearing from some economists this morning about changes to housing policy and related taxation measures.
Yeah, look, I've been to a variety of these economist lunches over the breakfast and lunches over the last couple of weeks. Very interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, UDIA had Tim Lawless, CoreLogic or whatever their new name is, speaking, and he gave this incredible data, which in a sense doesn't surprise me because you can see it happening on the ground. But he said that, and I think the figure he gave was 2020, in Perth, of the housing market, investors consisted of 15%, right? Mm-hmm. 15% in 2020. Now, in 25 coming into 26, it is now 40%. So you see that, and you can see it. I mean, every real estate agent I know has got a list of developers from investors, lawyers, doctors, accountants from Melbourne and Sydney buying up prices. And okay, there's obviously whole issues about being able to get supply and get adequate supply. But this demand, this massive demand caused by this influx of investors into the existing property market, I mean, it's just logic. The only thing that can do is driving those prices up. And I just hope that, and I think all the signs are that the federal government is going to finally do something about the capital gains discount and possibly negative gearing in the coming budget. Not something you can do actually at an election, as they've learnt before, because there's such a scare campaign that is raised. But if you want a reform like this, you have to do it a couple of years out for an election, and you have to do it at a time where you've got some political capital to expend. But I think, or my sense that I see, is that the younger generation see this as a massive issue of intergenerational fairness. And the baby boomers, what I'm seeing on a daily basis, actually recognising that this is not fair, that this has actually gone too far, and the impact that it's having on younger people is unacceptable. So I reckon the time is absolutely right for clawing back that capital gains tax discount and putting some real limits on negative gearing, encouraging negative gearing into the new market, new housing, and taking it out of the existing housing market.
Okay, early budget prediction. What are your thoughts, Libby?
Oh, look, I think something has to be done, and I agree with you. And I think one of the issues is that housing compared to places like Melbourne and Sydney and Perth is quite cheap. And so
not anymore.
Well,
they're leaving Melbourne and coming here.
No, that's what I mean. So that's why they're buying here, because they can still get value for their money. And the particularly Sydney investors see Perth as an absolute bargain basement centre to start buying stuff.
Far better place to live as well.
No, but they're investing.
I know.
A lot of these people are buying places sight unseen, they don't care. They're just investing and they want. I think something has to be done. But then we're going to, I think, in the next 2 decades, see that transfer of wealth from the boomers to the next generation too, which is going to skew the market again.
Well, what's my concern with that is that, that is true. For about 60% of people, they will get something, a reasonable transfer from parents or grandparents, right? But then there is this around 40%, apparently the calculation is, that will not get any reasonable benefits. So you are now. In my day, I look at myself as an example. I was someone that was never going to get any inherited wealth. My parents didn't own a home, fundamentally owned nothing. But I could, at the age of 24, buy a house. Bought a house in Perth, which I still live in. And I was able to do that. And it wasn't, you had to be a bit nimble and creative with your financing packages, but you could do it. But there's no way someone in my position, that came from a housing commission family that had no inherited wealth, would be able to do that today. And I think that is appalling, that you can't by, hard work and endeavour and being smart and quick off the mark, secure a foothold. So I think that I agree with you that lots of people ultimately will be and probably that's 60, maybe it's 65% of people will be okay. But you're going to have that other tranche that will be permanently excluded from the market unless they win lotto.
But again, it's about demand. We're not matching supply with demand.
Well, there's 2 things though, because we've got a lot more. In my view, we've got a lot more demand than we should have, because we've got all these investors who the taxation system is saying, don't, and I was very intrigued by Alan Kohler's analysis where whether or not it's causative, but he was able to show that a decline in productivity, so business investment, pretty well started around the same time that we got this capital gains discount, and the argument being that what our taxation system has done is encouraged us into unproductive investment, going around and buying up existing real estate. So that has it has put pressure on it's increased prices because you've got not only people looking to buy houses to live in, but you've got this massive market, now 40 to 50% of the market, which is people investing in real estate.
Fueled a property bubble as opposed to equity.
And that's right. And Angus Taylor's, he's got his little one-liner where he is going to go out and oppose this, saying if you tax anything, you get less of it, right? That's going to be... But that's... just doesn't apply if this is saying, okay, you can have benefits if you invest in new properties, but taking people out of the existing demand.
But I think we're also ignoring here that there is a segment of the young person's market who are buying properties that they can afford, that they're not living in, to get them onto the ladder.
Well, actually, this is interesting, Libby, because I do actually think this is, and sometimes I don't think these people really have thought this through, but absolutely. I went to a wedding of a young girl, and she's a FIFO worker, and she and the new husband, first thing, buying an investment property rather than, so that they can negatively gear. And it's become a sort of conventional wisdom, but I think, to me, it's really, I think sometimes those people really aren't actually understanding what, if you actually buy your own home, you get first home buyers grant, but also you get that property is capital gains tax
no,
free.
and I get that, and I'm seeing this with my son and his cohort. They've bought an investment property in Perth or wherever that might be. They're not living in it. They're renting it out. And because the market's done well, he now is selling that, and he's prepared to pay the capital gains and whatever else, so because that then is giving him a better deposit to actually now buy his own place that he will live in. And I think we've been able to see that, and people have been able to do that because we've seen that huge increase. And I see that same thing's been happening in Sydney. It did in Melbourne to a time, but now that's gone.
Yeah.
So at least it gives them that step on.
Yeah, but I do think, as I say, I think I don't know if you actually had proper objective tax advice that you would do that. But I do see that it has become because I think you're losing your capital gains. You could have had the same thing. You could have bought a dumpy little place, lived in it. You then sold it on, but you didn't have to pay.
But they couldn't. But to live where they want to live, and I think this is the difference. If that to live where they want to live, they can't afford.
Yeah. Well, and look, I do accept, and I have seen it, that there are younger generation, but I don't think that's the crux of the problem, because the number of people buying homes now without a mortgage like that, so people are actually paying cash, that is increasing dramatically.
They're buying investments.
But they're buying investments. But they're buying houses as investment with cash. There is that syndrome, which I have seen myself.
But our settings
I don't know
fuel
whether
that.
Sorry?
The settings fuel that.
Yeah, they do.
Well, it's the only way they can do it.
But it's... Well, they could do it another way, which is what a lot of people do. You buy your first little place. But anyhow, we're getting down in the weeds on this.
Let's stay on. We're not going to get to the end of our list. Let's stay on H. I would love to have your reflections on hydrogen. So, First Minister for Hydrogen within the WA government. It's been through, fair to say, a roller coaster in terms of sentiment and opinion and policy settings. How are you reading, say, the next 5 to 10 years for that sector?
Well, look, there's a couple of things, I think. So originally when we did our very first strategy, we had all these things happening in the 2040, we'd put that. And then, there seemed to be such interest and desire to invest that we actually brought forward our projections about to the 30s as to when things were going to happen. Now, I think in doing that, there was a couple of things that globally, we underestimated the need to actually build build the ecosystem, and I'm talking about, for example, even electrolyzers. Like the whole world, is only producing something like 1 or 2 gigawatts of electrolyzers a year. So you actually, to meet any of this demand, you've got to build all these massive
you need to build
factories,
the big and at scale.
and you need to build the factories to do that. And of course, then to do that, no one's going to go and build a gigafactory wherever unless there is a certainty of demand. And then people couldn't do their business case and get to FID because there wasn't, they couldn't guarantee the price at which, or even the availability of these electrolyzers. So the whole the manufacturing backside that you needed for hydrogen was completely far less developed than we'd really appreciated. So we were looking at the production of this stuff, but not really understanding in sufficient detail just what the manufacturing capability you needed behind it. So, and secondly, that really very few companies, hydrocarbon companies, were leaning into this. BP did genuinely lean into it. None of the others really did seriously. They did little bits, but weren't serious players in this. And there wasn't the mechanisms, and this is where I think you do need something like, without a fossil fuel tax, it's very hard to see how you're actually going to get to the point where this is happening. I think there is definitely still a role for hydrogen. I really think it makes sense, but it is going to take longer because we have just been so far behind the 8 ball, and quite frankly, I think we have to get to a point where we get US back into the world of sanity and reality in order to really drive the change globally.
So is that 2030 now pushed back out to 2040 or beyond?
No, look, I think and again, it all depends because, if you actually had the market signal. So I think there's the federal and state government have put some investments in trying to provide some infrastructure and whatever. But I think really you need to be able to have a very strong market signal. And it's very, very hard to have a strong market signal in a country that's export-oriented going alone. We can't unilaterally really put in place a fossil fuel tax when we are trading our product. We really have to try to rebuild that coalition, international coalition. And in the meantime, through ARENA and other investments, just keep the research going, get some capability emerging. But it is, unfortunately, without the US, I think in the market it's very, very hard but, who knows? Maybe China might be the help. Maybe China are also doing extraordinary things, not just in renewable energy, but maybe hydrogen. And I think it's interesting, China is very vulnerable. So in the last month, their oil supplies overwhelmingly came from Venezuela and Iran. Right, so they're losing access which is probably a big part of their push towards electrification and this development of this, is to get energy independence because they have been, and so they'll probably be in the prime position in terms of the development of technology.
Just the GST's debates hitting the front pages again. You've spent time in Canberra working, as a federal politician and here in Western Australia. What don't people in Canberra understand about Western Australia?
Well, it's not really, I think it's not what they don't understand, it's how they perceive things. So the perception is WA has been a mendicant state for a long time, and they have been the beneficiaries of the largesse of the rest of the country. Now they're coming into their own. They don't. This is the bureaucratic view and the view of a lot of people. They don't. But the reality is, and I spent a lot of my time when I was in federal parliament, making the arguments about these things. There's been from day one, like how taxes were imposed by the federal government. Were designed, I mean, not consciously to discriminate against Western Australia, but they had that impact because it's the metrics of the eastern states where the political power is that decides how things are structured. So just we had only just started to industrialise. New South Wales and Victoria had their gold rushes 40 years before ours. They had already industrialised. And we had, so when we became a single nation and we no longer had the benefit of any tariff protection, and so our fledgling industrial sector was really challenged. And you can go through ways in which the policies over East have kept us mendicant. And a classic one is BHP having that control over the Menzies government for so long to prevent WA exporting its iron ore. Not that BHP were intending to use it at that time. They had their steelmakers in Kembla and Whyalla. They didn't want the Japanese industry to be competing with them. So for a full decade, the Menzies government refused to allow us to revive the mining and export of iron ore. And that kept our state backward. That kept us in that poorer position. So and then finally with the credit squeeze of 1959, where after the collapse of wool and wheat prices, they had to have some more export income. Finally, WA was allowed to start establishing its iron ore business. So and this was to prop up BHP in the eastern states. We were sacrificed. So it's this argument that we've been this beneficiary. Well, no, it's a much more complex argument than that. And I also say, let's look at how the current GST is structured, like these billions of dollars of revenue that Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland get from gambling revenue, they are kept off the agenda. There is also the way remoteness is defined. The maximum remoteness that's considered is the distance from Sydney to the border of New South Wales. So it's 1,200 kilometres. So you don't get any advantage. There's no recognition that we've got schools and hospitals and communities that are 2,000 kilometres, 2,500 kilometres away. And so this is how they see it. They don't actually understand that there has in fact been some systemic calculations that are made against WA. And you see it in both sides of politics have been guilty of it. I must say, I think now there's been more of an awareness. But, you'll have programs. Like I remember Labor had a solar program, and you had to a massive amount of money that was going into solar projects, but you had to be able to connect into the national electricity grid. And, I'm going over and talking to Martin Ferguson, and they're going to say, guys, you do realise we are not on the national grid. Like, we can't get rid of it. And there were sort of equivalent, policies and funding in everything that has been to our detriment. So, look, it's a complex issue. But I think it's good for us to keep fighting.
Very good. Thank you. We've covered a lot of ground, but not all of it. So we'll have to make sure there's a part two, Alannah. Really appreciate your time this morning.
Excellent. Well, most enjoyable. Lovely to see you again, Patrick and Libby. Fantastic.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Alannah.